This is John Nugent.
I'm Sam Long.
And I'm Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. I'm going to apologize in advance. Our minds are elsewhere for this episode. We're recording this in November. It won't come out till mid-December, but we're leaving, all three of us, tomorrow on a jet plane.
Don't know when we'll be back again.
We're heading to San Diego for a Bible Nerd Conference, the Society of Biblical Literature, and we're very much thinking about that, and mostly the getting away part. I think the three of us in our administrative positions have had significant, extra level of requirements. I don't know.
Yeah, other things have been distracting us, and on the one hand, we are committed to you, the listeners, that we want to stay on top of our podcast. We're not going to just bail out. But at the same time, I think all of us are ready for a mental break. And the great thing is, like, going to the Society of Biblical Literature is like we get to be students for a while. You know, you still interact, you ask questions, and so it's not like you're passive participants. But rather than going there and feeling like we've got to impress everybody with our intellectual abilities, we get to be recipients. And we get to enjoy a little bit of vacation time in Southern California. So looking forward to that.
Yeah. Not quite vacation time, but definitely a change in pace.
Right.
And like you said, the diet, like not being responsible.
Right.
Right? Like not having people who are come to us asking questions or asking us to do things. We just get to go with the flow of the conference. See, this is, we are fried. We were observing that, you know, this semester's schedule, normally we have like a break about a third of the way into the semester, and then that takes you through Thanksgiving break. And we used to have two small breaks that kind of divided up the semester into three chunks. But this year is kind of like one mini break, like just a day off.
Right, one day off.
So really it's been a steady flow up until November 20th. Right. And this is the big week off that we just need mentally, physically, spiritually, otherwise. All the Elise.
Yeah. And Thanksgiving is even a little bit later this year, like that on the calendar.
Yep.
And so, we kind of need a little bit of a mental break for the final push. You know, we'll come back, we'll have 2 full weeks of classes, and then we have our finals week, which still has a little bit of class time in it. And it's like you said, it's not like we're going on vacation. We're going to be sitting in, hearing lots of papers, and it's going to be a really great, Bible nerd kind of an activity. But to sit and listen, and we'll engage, we'll ask questions and be participants. But a little bit of mental break's going to be good. I hope this episode goes well. I hope this isn't like the worst thing we put out there.
Oh, no, there's worse, for sure.
Have you ever heard the first episode we ever put out?
Yeah. If you haven't, don't go back and listen to it. You'll be fine.
We're still trying to get our feet beneath us.
So we're summoning the last fruits of our of her energy, and we're directing it all toward Micah Chapter 3.
We sure are. So if you have somehow stumbled on this podcast and not the others, we were going through the book of Micah, and we're doing it verse by verse, and so hopefully it is edifying for you. Should we do a quick? He's an 8th century prophet, same time as like an Isaiah. He comes in, and things seem to be going okay for the nation, but they are very corrupt, and they have this great opportunity to live out Torah, and the leaders choose not to. They don't say much about the regular people, but definitely the leaders choose not to. And so Micah comes along and says, you're not doing a great job. You're not living out the covenant. So that good enough?
Perfect.
All right. Perfect. We don't care. They're so apathetic about this right now. Like, whatever you say, Sam. All right. So we're going to start in Micah Chapter 3, verse 1. I'm going to read the first 4 verses. It says, "And I said, listen, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel. Should you not know justice? You who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin off my people and the flesh off their bones, who eat the flesh of my people and flay the skin off them. They break their bones in pieces and chop them up like meat in a kettle, like flesh in a cauldron. Then they will cry to Yahweh, but he will not answer them. He will hide his face from them at that time because they have acted wickedly."
Man, that is like harsh.
It's great.
You see some pretty, crazy stuff in here, but this is like, this whole idea of like throwing them in the pot, taking the flesh off their bones. like, this is cannibalism.
Yes.
It's like horrible. But I'm sure it's because God's trying to make a point. Like, you have become so bad that this is the only way I can actually describe you. And so the language here is pretty startling, to say the least.
We can assume it's hyperbolic, that they're not
Yeah.
actually engaging in cannibalism.
Right.
But just, but the effect of what they're doing, which we don't know yet, which we'll find out, I think, in the rest of the chapter, although we've known a little bit about it. But what they're doing has the effect of just destroying people and treating them as like almost food for themselves to feast upon. And it's just like, it's awful, the things that they're doing.
Would there be like a shock value? Like, if you imagine the original audience hearing this, would there be some people who would almost be like, kind of taking a step back or feeling like, wow, the language is that kind of hyperbole? Is there a little bit of a shock value that maybe some of the original audience would have experienced hearing this?
I would say definitely. I mean, cannibalism is a big no-no. You don't eat
Big
humans.
time, yeah.
And you don't cook them up in pots.
Right.
So why, it may not be self-evident to people listening, why is this not just describing cannibalism?
Why is it not literal? It's like, wow, they're eating each other. That's amazing. I didn't realize this was so bad.
That's a good question. How do you know when something is exaggeration for effect and when it's literal? I assume because nowhere else do we see this being a problem for the Israelites, right?
Cannibalism was not a sin that they were guilty of.
Yeah. And it's like, even they wouldn't do that, right? They're terrible people, but even they wouldn't do that. And I think in the context of, like, he's talking about all these things that they do wrong. And I'm trying to think of whether there's like Torah explanations for that or not. But either way, for me, you read it and I just don't think that it's literal. In the same way that when Jesus says, someone causes you to sin, cut off your hand. Like, I don't think he means that. I think just a normal reading of the text allows you to say that.
Well, like, so when people are like, economically oppressing the people around them, like they're taking advantage of them, they're taking their land and all that kind of stuff. We see that happening. Like, it's not any kind of an exaggeration to say that there's economic oppression that's happening to the people. And to portray that as a kind of cannibalism, like you're eating your own people by doing that. Is that an okay way of looking at this? It's like to say what you're doing so bad, we're going to portray it as a kind of cannibalism.
Yeah, I think your method is sound.
Thank you.
We have 3 other books written during the same time period, and none of them detail cannibalism as what's going on.
Right.
You would need some kind of this is just so generic, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like you're devouring the people.
Right.
That in what way? You would have to go to the rest of the book. You're luring them into their houses and you're clubbing them from behind, and but cannibalism doesn't seem to be a problem in any of the other 8th century prophets, and it's a huge enough offense that it would be striking by its absence.
Yeah.
So that might be, to me, it's the most compelling reason to think we shouldn't read this literally. This is an image of the leaders who should be serving, providing, protecting, especially the weakest of society, right?
Yeah,
and upholding the common good of all and making sure no one falls through the cracks. Those people are the ones who are taken advantage of. They're preying on them. And that's what prey does. It stalks, the prey, or predators do, right? They stalk the prey, and then they strike them, and they devour them. Yeah. And it's an apt metaphor for what's happening. But if you want the details of what this looks like on the ground, don't go to culinary language, but go to the surrounding passages that talk about economic exploitation.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's intentionally graphic and there's some shock value there.
Yeah.
Just to get them to realize how bad it is they're doing, because seemingly they were unaffected. They're happily taking advantage of their fellow countrymen and women and don't care. But if you turn it into something that would be objectionable, now it's like, oh, well, I guess you put it that way. Kind of reminds me of a little bit of, of Nathan's confrontation of David, where he talks about the little ewe lamb and the guy coming to, and David's outraged by it. He's like, by the way, that's what you did. Like, oh, well, I guess you put it that way. Because seemingly he was like oblivious to the fact that was a terrible thing to do until Nathan reframed it. And perhaps that's what Mike is doing. He's reframing it in such a way like, well, I guess if you put it that way, we probably should stop taking advantage of one another.
Yeah, didn't realize it's so bad until you put it in such graphic imagery.
Yeah.
And this chapter hangs together. There's 3 units in it. 1 through 4, 5 through 8, 9 to 12, and they're all oracles directed toward different leadership groups, and they're all talking about leaders. So the first one, it just says heads and rulers. The second one will be prophets, and the third one will be rulers and chiefs. Right. So I think once we get to the end of the third one, that gives a little more context too, and
Yeah,
I think we can reflect on the implication of having 3 oracles addressing the leaders,
Right.
and like the function of those oracles for the people of Israel. But I don't want to get to that until we've read all 3.
No, right. I think 3 will definitely fill in what the actual offenses are, and it's not cannibalism. Yeah. I will just say one thing. I was reading Alter, his commentary on this, and he talks about in verse 3, where they translate it, break their bones into pieces. He talked about the word is like you break open the bones so you can suck out the marrow is more of what they're talking about.
Okay.
Which they're getting everything, right? They're taking literally everything they can from these people. And then they'll throw the bones in and make soup, right? And so nothing's wasted in the sense of just the totality of taking. And that's just very stark imagery.
You're talking about Robert Alter's 3-volume translation with commentary?
Yes.
Gotcha. In case anyone wants to look that up.
Yeah.
Highly recommended.
Highly recommended. But the point of it all is, so he addressed them and says, hey, you leaders who should know right and wrong, you clearly don't because you're cannibalizing the people, metaphorically. And he says, but then you're going to cry out, and what's going to happen? Why would I listen to you? Right? You're the ones who's supposed to know right or wrong, and then you come to me acting like, God, why aren't things correct? Like, you should know. You know better. And he says, I'm going to hide my face from you because you've acted wickedly. And I was going to say, this plays into lots of other things, but we sometimes frame God as the cuddly, forgiving grandfather who's there with a little candy for you if you just come sit in his lap. And that the Bible regularly in the Psalms and other places talks about how God just like refuses to listen to you. Your prayers are empty because you have this sin. This sin is like the barrier between you and God. And like we don't talk about that enough. Where people wonder why, like, oh my gosh, my life's a wreck and God doesn't seem to listen or care. Like, have you thought about maybe stop doing that thing you keep doing and are unrepentant about? And so that's what he says is, in what world am I listening to you, despite being the loving God of his people, because you have this unrepentant sin in your life?
And I suspect the crying out that he's anticipating they've started to do or will do soon may have to do with the historical situation of Assyria is closing in on Israel, and the heads of the people, the rulers, are going to want God's protection.
Yeah.
And he's like, when you call out for help and I don't answer, this is why.
So don't view God as a God with a pocket full of butterscotches just waiting to, bless you or whatever. But I mean, part of your point there I think is important is that God is especially watching out for the people who are suffering. These people who probably think, God's on our side are part of that oppressive class. And God's like, I'm not looking out for you. I'm looking out for the people who can't look out for themselves. And it's your actions against them that are bringing about my wrath. And so in many ways, it's a comforting view of God that he looks out for people who can't look out for themselves. And those are the ones he's most moved by.
Real talk. Are butterscotch discs like a top candy? I mean, they're so simple, but they're just wonderful.
They really are.
For me.
Wonder.
Agree.
Okay.
I like butterscotch, so yeah, it's a great flavor.
Okay.
Of hard candy suckers, I think
Right.
butterscotch may be my favorite.
Hard to beat.
Yeah.
I do like those weird little strawberry ones with the wrappers. I don't know why. There's a little bit of core in the middle that has a little chewy thing in the middle. I don't know.
Oh,
do we even know what those are
The
called?
pineapple ones?
No, well, there are pineapple. Strawberry is the standard, though.
Oh, I don't know about that one.
It's basically the exact same thing, but strawberry.
Oh, gotcha.
Really? It's got the red wrapper with the green top on it?
You're trying to get yourself to the core so you get that little chewy part of it. It's like that reward.
In what world do you not know what I'm talking about? That's like the ubiquitous candy.
You're going to have to show me a picture.
Oh my, a picture.
It's not coming to mind.
We're really going off the rails here.
So how about
I take full responsibility. I just,
about 5 to 8, Ron?
Okay. Good work, John.
I'll do that. I'll read 5 to 8. Thank you for bringing us back, John. Way to exert your leadership power.
Only because I have nothing to add to the strawberry candy.
5 to 8. Thus says the Lord concerning the prophets who lead my people astray, who cry peace when they have something to eat, but declare war on those who put nothing in their mouths. Therefore it shall be night to you without vision, and darkness to you without revelation. The sun shall go down upon the prophets, and the day shall be black over them. The seers shall be disgraced, and the diviners put to shame. They shall cover their lips, for there is no answer for God. But as for me, I am filled with power, with the Spirit of the Lord, and with justice and might, to declare to Jacob his transgression, and to Israel his sin. I kind of like that last line. That's a
pretty
great
good.
last line. But as for me, here, this is God's word to the prophets who are basically bringing false prophecies, right? They're crying out peace, and they're like telling the rulers what they want to hear and the people in positions of power. Prophets who tell them what they want to hear. And God's like, yeah, good luck with that. It's not going to go that way.
Yeah, this likely shows the difference between Micah, who's a country boy who has a word from God, and the court prophets who that's their actual job, right? And he seems to be pushing against these who perhaps are, and then falling on the heels of 4, who are telling the leaders what they want to hear. Maybe perhaps a very like Zionistic type of theology where it's fine. As long as we have a descendant of David, we got the temple, we got all the things we need. God will never turn his back on us, and which they would love to hear. But Micah says, but you're wrong, and it's not actually how it's going to turn out. And in fact, your visions are going to disappear, which makes me wonder if they had any to begin with. But
Right.
they're going to go dark, and it's going to turn into such where you're all. He says the seers are going to be disgraced, and I think that might imply where they're going to be proven wrong, and. They're going to keep saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace, and then when Assyria comes, and then eventually Babylon comes, they're going to be shown to be completely wrong, and then the state of mourning begins.
Yeah, this develops, I think, a theme that's pretty prominent in the Bible, throughout many of the prophets, and you see Jesus encountering this and the apostles in their day, that there were lots of people claiming to speak for God.
Yeah.
And it seemed like the ones who were sharing genuine words from God are the minority. And if that was the case in the 8th century, it's going to be the case again in the 6th and 7th century prophets. It's going to be the same again in the post-exilic prophets. Jesus is encountering false prophets. The disciples, the letters are, beware of false prophets and false teachers that are coming in among you. Like, it leads me to believe that there are probably false prophets in our own day.
Yeah.
That we should beware for those who are claiming to speak for God, but they're saying words that are not from the Lord and that proclaim good tidings for people, telling them things that they want to hear, things that if they continue preaching this, they will continue to be supported by the people they're preaching to.
Right. Yeah, especially to people in positions of power. And I think that's kind of what you see here is that you have people like, the governors and the kings and all that, and you have prophets who are just like, hey, I'll tell you what you want to hear. They're not saying that out loud, but they know what the king wants to hear. And so they provide a prophecy or a word from God of some sort. And for those good prophecies, they're living a good life. They have good food, good clothes, comfortable position, probably a nice place to live. And so they're making a good living by telling them that. And so you have people like Micah who are like, I'm just not going to play that game. I'm going to listen to God, and whatever he tells me, I am going to speak that. And if that means I don't get to be one of the courtesans of the king, then that's the way it goes. But I think we have a lot of people in positions of power who are looking for people who are going to reinforce their ideas and their plans and their agendas. And yeah, you'll have no shortage of people who will speak in God's name and tell you you're doing exactly what God wants you to do.
Yeah. I think support for that approach is this thing about prophets is sandwiched between two oracles toward the heads and the rulers of the people. That this is the context of these prophets. And they're prophesying in that context and in the favor of the chiefs because they want power. They want to exercise power, or they want to make a difference with the power brokers. They maybe they have some positive reforms in mind, and they go to the top where the people with the resources and with the connection, and they contextualize their message for those in a position to force their agenda forward or who will reward them. And Micah doesn't say, you can go ahead and have the power. I will prophesy in weakness. He actually says it the opposite. It's like, as for me, I am filled with power and with justice and might because he has the Spirit of the Lord. In other words, where they're going is not where the true power is and not where the power of the Lord is. And he, speaking to the truth, sticking with justice, he's at the heart of where God's heart is, and that's where the true power is.
I think it's important what you said to delineate. I think there's maybe two different motives at play. I'm not talking about more modern day, like the application, where I think that there are people who definitely are trying to manipulate others for something, right? For more power, for more acclaim, to enact something. It reminds me a little bit of when I think of those people in the Lord of the Rings, the second movie, the guy who's like,
Wormtongue.
To the king, right?
Yeah, Wormtongue.
Right? And like that's what I think we kind of think of when we talk about that. Like there are those people out there. They're weaselly, they're trying to get that thing done. But I think that when I look around sort of the landscape, the political landscape, especially of America, I think there are religious leaders who are just wrong theologically about things. And they're doing it, I think, from the right intention, for at least from good intentions, in the sense of, I want to make this thing happen because I think God's going to work in it. But I think they're viewing it from the wrong perspective. And so I think there's two different kinds of prophetic voices that I think it's important to delineate, because I would not put those people in the same category as the worm-tongued guy, right?
Yeah.
They're not weaselly. I just think they're misunderstanding what God's doing in the world. And it stems from just a tradition probably of bad theology and a mixing of nationalism and the kingdom and so forth. And I just wish we could get through and say, no, this is not what you should use your prophetic voice to proclaim.
Yeah, totally agree.
Appreciate that.
Hey, anytime, bro. Anything, there's a Lord of the Rings reference you're very excited
You know
about.
what? We can just stop recording right now because we have, hit
Peaked
that
right
ball.
there.
Yep. I can't add anything more to that.
So if you want to go further, like Gandalf is the Micah, and then,
There you go.
the Wormtail the other, they're the powers that are saying what people want to hear.
Yeah, but I think your point is so well taken because, again, when we make these prophets out to be professionally evil people, or these rulers to be professionally evil rulers, they probably don't think of themselves as being wicked. They don't think of themselves as being bad leaders. They probably think they're doing what's right. They're referred to as prophets because people see them as being mouthpieces for God. They probably have more in common with people who are teaching false things today, but have no idea that they're doing it.
Yeah, because like I said, that sort of Zionistic theology that comes from a somewhat okay place. I mean, God makes this promise to David and his descendants, and they're like God loves us. God wants us to succeed, right? I get that, but not at the cost of these other things. That's what they're missing, right? The other side of it, which is, yes, but you're oppressing your own people, so why would God bless that?
All right. Third section on leaders who were called out by function. Micah 3, verses 9 through 12. Hear this, you rulers of the house of Jacob and chiefs of the house of Israel, who abhor justice and pervert all equity, who build Zion with blood and Jerusalem with wrong. Its rulers give judgments for a bribe. Its priests teach for a price. Its prophets give oracles for money. Yet they lean upon the Lord and say, surely the Lord is with us. No harm shall come upon us. Therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field. Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountains of the temple a wooded height. Here we have, both first, the previous oracles use language of the house of Jacob and the house of Israel, which makes you think northern kingdom. But this oracle is just in case you might miss it, this has relevance for the southern kingdom too.
Right, yeah.
Exactly in the capital city, exactly on Mount Zion, exactly where the temple is. That's where priests, not just rulers, but priests and prophets are doing it for money. And the thing they presume in their prophetic and priestly ministry is that the Lord is on our side.
Yeah.
And especially, you talk about Zionist theology. It's kind of like Jerusalem's always right. Jerusalem's always on God's side.
Yeah.
We should always be in support of Jerusalem. Here is the prophet leaning in on Israel during a period when Jerusalem really was the capital of the southern kingdom,
Exactly.
the place where the Lord's presence uniquely dwelled because the temple was there. Like, it's in that place that God says, just because you're centered here doesn't mean you got a free pass from God. He doesn't like what he sees, and even Zion will be plowed as a field, become a heap of ruins. And so there's no safety in your proximity to the capital, religious and political center.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure, excuse me, I'm sure there are a lot of people who looked at the temple's presence in Jerusalem and said, this is where we have built a dwelling for Yahweh. And so, yeah, those northern 10 tribes, they broke off and that bad stuff's going to happen to them. But there's probably at least a certain segment of the population who just think God will never let his dwelling place be destroyed. As long as we're maintaining it and we're going through the motions of maintaining the temple, the directives, God will protect us. And there's a lot of that probably thinking going on. And God is just saying to them, that's a horrible way to think. Don't think for a moment that I will not let my house be destroyed if you guys are not going to honor me by your lives. That you only get to have my house as a dwelling place when you honor me by following my instructions. Ignore my instructions, I'll just take it all away. I think it's a horrible misunderstanding of how God views his temple there in Jerusalem.
And over it's kind of a two-pronged attack. On the one hand, he hits the rulers and chiefs because, again, they're pouring justice, perverting rights, building Zion with blood, which seems to indicate that they're taking advantage in some way of their countrymen and women. And then he turns and says the rulers, priests, and prophets are doing it for money. They're doing their thing for money, which then you wonder, are they justifying it or getting like approval from these other spiritual type leaders to say, oh yeah, it's fine. It's no big deal. And so, like, everyone's culpable, not just the actual people who are mouthpieces, but the people who then have the money and are doing these sorts of things. And they turn around and go to God and say, well, he's with us, right? And of course, he's not with you. Not like this. And so this idea that Jerusalem is sort of impregnable, like there's no way it can be overcome, is just ludicrous. In fact, you're up here on a high mountain, but it's just going to be plowed like a field. And which would be, if you've ever been to Jerusalem, it's not a field. It's on the side of a hill.
Yeah.
And it's just like that's not how it works. But the point is, like, this very graphic imagery again of just going to be laid completely low, and it would be ludicrous for them to hear, I think, because they're so ingrained in this. Like, you are a crazy person right now, Micah, to suggest that Jerusalem would go down. As you said, the temple's here, God's presence is here. We're in good shape. And so to even actually say that, like, of course this is why other prophets are going to be persecuted and, thrown in stocks and so forth for having the audacity to suggest that Jerusalem could fall. But Micah was well ahead of his time in saying, no, this is actually what's going to happen.
Yeah. And the motive here is money.
Yeah.
The rulers give judgment for a bribe. It sounds like judges, right?
Yep.
Priests for a price, prophets for money. Like, these people are in this time of the second golden age where there's money to be made. The spiritual leaders have kind of been captivated by the allure of wealth, and it is what's attracting them. And it's connected to this cannibalism, right? The money is not magically growing on trees. It's coming from someone.
Yeah, right.
Right? And it's the poor people out in the country who are, working hard, barely making it by, and somehow the money in Jerusalem, it's kind of all flowing uphill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which it shouldn't, right? It should be going the other way. Just judgments are flowing down from the mountain of God's presence and flowing and covering the people. Instead, there's a stream of ill-gotten wealth that is going against gravity and ended up in the hands of the spiritual and political leaders of Israel.
Do you think that people are viewing Yahweh too much like the way their neighbors view their own gods? That, we're going to go through the cult, we're going to do all these things, and God will protect us, as long as we just sort of go through the motions. Like, everybody thinks their own local deity is going to protect them until some greater power comes along and, destroys them. And are they just viewing God in a way that's too much like the nations around them, instead of realizing that God has called them to be a different people, giving a different vision of what life is supposed to look like, that it goes beyond going through the motions? Are they just too much? Like I said, is their worship too much like the worship of other nations, and seeing God just like anybody else's local deities.
Yeah. I mean, it's not the emphasis of this chapter, but we see it in other chapters. This is not the empty worship chapter, right? And
Fair enough.
it's the you do things for money chapter. You've been given responsibility over the people of Israel to do good, to promote the common good, to raise up the poor and the needy, and somehow they're not any better off because of your leadership, and you keep getting wealthier and wealthier. That's the sin here.
Yeah, I would say that's actually the connection you're thinking about is for the Israelites, there is a connection between social justice and religion and other things that may be absent in other cultures, right? And so, yes, on the one hand, it's for them, it's all connected, as opposed to other cultures where their deity is their genie that they're trying to keep happy,
Right.
and so often social justice type things take a backseat to that. I just thought of this, and you tell me if I'm wrong. So in verse 11, it talks about the three groups: rulers, priests, prophets, and clearly it's just three main groups of leaders that he's calling out. But I wonder if you were a person who's being oppressed, right? Where you're one of these poor people, and someone's coming to take your land, and so you go to a judge, and they accept a bribe, and they rule against you. You go to a priest and say, "What? This isn't right, right? You know better than that, right?" And they take a bribe and they ignore you. And then you go to the prophet and say, "Could you the word? Can you talk about an oracle from God in my favor? Everyone knows it's wrong." And he takes a bribe and says, "No, I'm not getting that oracle." I wonder if there's almost a progression. I don't know if that's valid or not, but that's kind of the feeling I get in that.
Yeah, you can kind of see where people are looking for anybody to stand with
that's
them.
definitely true. Yeah.
Yeah, we're supposed to be a people who are set apart, who just have a radically different view of what life looks like. And really, these are the people, especially the priests and the prophets, people can love or dislike the kingship or whatever. But at the very least, with priests and prophets, they're supposed to be representatives of God. And everywhere you turn, these people are not representing God very well to you. And so I can see a kind of frustration, you're going to them expecting them to be on your side, but the bribe makes them go the opposite direction.
Yeah, I like that reading. It reminds me of the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? The people you would expect would walk by the guy in the ditch and be different, be better, care about it, aren't. And the way God, created Israel, if you look at Deuteronomy, it's kind of like the political constitution of Israel, especially in the middle chapters. And, God has a balance of powers. There's not just one king over the people. There's priests to holding, the kings accountable and with their Torah instruction. There are judges to give good judgments. There are prophets when the priests aren't doing their job. There's always someone to call out the person who's doing it for gain or for themselves, and where justice isn't happening. But here, I think, it doesn't matter where they go. Any leader that they go to is going to be the same answer, motivated by money. And so there's no advocate for the people. And so when there's no human advocate for the people, the Lord steps in, right?
Yep.
And then he levels the playing field with his judgment on the land. So I think it's a great point. And this is this is the beginning. We're in the middle of Oracle 2, which is chapters 3 through 5. And we talked about there's 3 oracles in the book of Micah. Each one has a section of judgment followed by a section of hope. Mm-hmm. And so this oracle of judgment all revolved around the leaders, right? 3 different leadership groups. And so the oracle of hope begins in chapter 4 and spans through 5. It's the biggest section of forward-looking hope.
Yep.
Want to turn toward that, Sam?
Sure, I'm going to read 1 through 5. Chapter 4, 1 through 5, not chapter. Oh, doesn't matter. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's temple shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised up above the hills. People shall stream to it, and many nations shall come and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and shall arbitrate between strong nations far away. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall all sit under their own fig trees, and no one shall make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. For all the peoples walk, each in the name of his God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever." And so he envisions So it's like the doom of chapter 3 is replaced by this fresh vision of hope in chapter 4, and he's speaking of this restoration that's going to happen again. So Zion's plowed as a field, and then now all of a sudden it's going to be raised up again as the highest place in Israel, which it's not technically, but when this happens, it will be. And there's just this big reversal that's going to take place.
Well, and what I love about this is that, God certainly has issues with the nation, but it's never like, I'm going to judge you and that's just the end. I'm going to punish you and it really stinks to be you. But it's always followed up with this message of the future where once God has addressed the problems, that there's still a vision of hope. And that's what I think is really exciting about the prophets. I think there are a lot of Christians who see the prophets as the doom and gloom sections. Like they see chapter 3 and they assume that's all Micah is about. And they forget that that's immediately followed by this vision of a restored Israel who's going to ultimately fulfill what God created them to do in the first place. I love those sections.
Yeah. And this one, if it sounds familiar, it's because Isaiah 2, 2 through 4, casts a vision of future hope in strikingly similar language. Right. But it's cool looking at kind of this vision of future hope because it ties back to Israel's original calling to be a blessing to all nations. If they live out Torah, nations will come to them and say, wow, what other nation has such just statutes as the ones that we have today? Exactly. And, Israel is supposed to have an attractive witness to the nations. Mm-hmm. And as much as Micah sees corruption among the nation right now, they're in a situation where God's going to level them. He's not going to raise them up. That's the next thing. Is not this beautiful witness to the nations. The next thing is being leveled to the ground, but that's not the end of it. And I know Walter Brueggemann has this book, Prophetic Imagination. It's kind of a famous one, and he talks about the nature of biblical prophecy. And I think this gets at what you're saying, Ron. Biblical prophecy has this twofold nature: it energizes and it criticizes. And some people, they're really big on the criticizing, and they're like, Micah 3 prophets. Yep. And there are certain people who are like Micah 4 prophets. They're really big on the energizing. But Micah can hold them two together and say, there is a time for judgment and there's a time for restoration. And when the judgment comes, and it is severe, and you're going to think you've lost it all, the whole purpose of this is to shape and refine you so that Israel can aspire to their original calling from God, which is to be an exemplary nation held up by God before all other nations so that God can draw all people to himself through the witness of his extraordinary people. And I just think it's really cool that, the way this concisely brings that together. What are the key components of this vision that stand out to you guys, like in this prophetic oracle? Visions of hope.
I'm not sure what you're looking for, but what stands with me is he says in days to come, and this is right after the destruction. So it's not maybe God will back off and not actually make it happen. This is after the destruction happens, after the consequences. So I start with that as saying sometimes you got to go through some stuff. Like there are consequences to actions, there are judgments that take place. God doesn't leave you there. In days to come, he offers something else. And so we start with that. But this idea of just I just love that imagery, and I wish our churches embraced it, and I wish it actually happened, but where people just stream to Zion or stream to the church because this is the place, man. Why would we go anywhere else? It's kind of like, well, it's not like that at all, but we had a Zap Zone open up, a Super XL Zap Zone not too long ago. Like that thing is packed all the time. That's like the place to go in Lansing right now, in West Lansing, And
I was there 2 days ago.
And I'm not saying the church is supposed to be Zap Zone.
Playing
right?
pinball.
Right. It's fun, right? But this it's just so inviting, and like this is why would I go anywhere else for truth, for justice, for religion? Like it's all here. In Israel, in Jerusalem, and that image is just I don't know. That's the dream, right, of what the church could be.
Yeah. What I like is right there at the beginning when it says, "Peoples shall stream to it, and many nations shall come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk into his paths. The international scope of this helps us to understand why God raised up Israel in the first place. He didn't raise up Israel to be his little pet project, while the rest of the world is just, going to hell in a handbasket. God did it so that Israel can provide a vision for the rest of the world to emulate and to embrace. Their job is to show the world a better way and for the world to go, that is so weird. That is just not the way we do things. But oh my gosh, look at all the good that's coming out of it. And so for me, this really does anticipate what we see like in the book of Acts. As the gospel begins to go out into the Gentiles and the Gentiles begin to embrace it. It's like this is the very thing that God envisioned for Israel, and it finds its fulfillment in the outworking of the church, finally bringing the Gentiles in as God envisioned, centuries before.
So what do you make of, the image here is God's people are this centralized place where they hold the core together and people stream to them. But then you go to Acts and it's just like they're not streaming to Jerusalem. People from Jerusalem are going out to the nations. So what is that? I mean, has this approach of them streaming to God's people been replaced with we've got to go out to them? Because now it's in the new covenant era, and they're not coming to us, so we've got to go to them, and that can be used to say like people aren't coming into our churches, so we have to like go to where the people are. We have to go into the schools. We got to go to the state capitals. We got to bring God's teachings to Washington. Or we've got to bring God's teaching to the state capitol. And how do you hold together this kind of the going out to the peoples of the New Testament with this vision of streaming to God's people?
Yeah, it's definitely a tension, but I think the tension is also bound up here too, where it says, "Come, let us go to Jerusalem," and then it says, "But for out of Zion shall go forth instruction." Does it mean like we'll go forth to the people who gathered there, or does it mean go forth beyond the borders of Jerusalem, Judah? I don't know, but I think at least from their perspective is that even so we knocked all these prophets and these leaders who are like, oh, as long as we have Zion, we're fine. But here, Micah kind of embraces that on some level to say, but here is where God has chosen to sort of for these things to emanate from, whether it's people gathering or I think maybe an and/or situation, or it's also going out. Because the implication is that there's this judging between peoples and arbitrating between nations, which that seems to be an outward focus. But they're it's both. They're streaming and it's disseminating outward. So for me, it's kind of a both and, not an either or.
So the word is going out, and then people are drawn to it.
Right.
People are drawn in because the word's going out.
Yeah.
I would, going beyond that, not to find fault, but just something different comes into my mind, is that in the Old Testament, in Jerusalem is the temple. This is where God has made his dwelling, and his presence is manifest there in the temple. But in the New Testament era, God is manifesting his presence in his people. God pours out his spirit upon his people. And we see that at Pentecost, and we see it like in the house of Cornelius. And so the idea is that we don't go to a specific city to encounter God anymore. God has poured out his spirit upon all flesh. And so wherever you have God's spirit, you've got God's temple in a sense. And I don't mean that literally, I mean that metaphorically. And so the people become the temple. God doesn't send his presence back into the temple. After the exile, they rebuild the temple, but they don't get any manifestation of his presence. And even into the New Testament era, it's not like you've got like a Shekinah glory re-inhabiting the temple. And you don't get anything until the day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2. And so there's a sort of re-imaging of what it means to be like the dwelling of God in God's temple. And so I think the New Testament takes that up and says, we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. It's not the temple in Jerusalem. And so wherever you have believers gathered together, I think they would say we are now fulfilling this passage. People are seeing the temple of God wherever you have believers gathered together. And so if that's not the full answer, I certainly think that would be a part of the answer to that question.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, with Jesus, has this salt and light, kind of the twofold image. We are a light, we're a city on a hill, he talks about.
Right,
that's what the church is. The hill is no longer Jerusalem. Days are coming when they're going to worship on this mountain or that mountain, but everywhere in spirit and truth, which is what you described. And so I still think, the church has been scattered throughout the earth like salt,
Right, yeah.
gone into all nations. And where there is the church and the Spirit of God is in their midst, there is a vibrant witness to God's kingdom, and the people in our neighborhoods and towns should be drawn to it. And so there's the difference between the Old Testament and New Testament is Jerusalem is like one city on one hill. And in the New Covenant, we have multiple cities on multiple metaphorical hills.
Yeah.
Right. And so the church has come to the people in the sense as have come to the nations, but it still comes to the nations as a people who has a unique life together that reflects God's intentions for all creation and is attractive, and they teach his word, and that word goes forward from the Christian community, and as it goes out and people see it in action, they are drawn to God through the church's witness.
Yeah, amen.
So I think Jesus, he's contextualizing it for the new covenant mission, but still this streaming dynamic seems to be in play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I say I think it's a both and. On the one hand, your church should be inviting and engaging enough that people stream to it. If they're not, the solution is not to take your not inviting stuff out into the world, right? Right. And so on the one hand, yes, you need to have something that people actually want. At the same time, you can't be so cloistered, right, where you carry Christ's death and resurrection with you wherever you go. So it doesn't just take place in the church, but the same place it is kind of like the Jerusalem, where that's the focal point, but it definitely emanates and goes beyond that. So it's great imagery. It's just this is 4:1-4 is fantastic. It's like for me one of the best passages in the Bible.
Oh yeah,
and
this passage.
The other two themes are peace.
Yeah,
right. The nations are no longer at war with one another, and then economic prosperity. People aren't afraid. They've got enough food. They've got their own tree with their own fruit. There's economic prosperity throughout the earth. There is peace throughout the earth. This is God's vision for all creation. And it's worth saying there's nothing here about days are to come when God's going to be done with this violent world and he's going to whisk people off to heaven. That's not the hope here.
Yeah.
It's like things are going to change down here on earth.
Right, yeah.
And there is going to be peace, and there is going to be economic abundance, and there's going to be security. And all the peoples of the world do one thing or another, but we walk in the name of the Lord God. And he's the one who's going to bring about this future world of peace and economic prosperity.
Yeah, and I would say that this for me highlights also kind of the now and not yet aspect of the kingdom, because it doesn't say all peoples will stream. It doesn't say God will judge all nations. And there are still other apparently people who aren't interested in this. And then it ends with kind of a weird, and there's a bunch of people who are going to follow whatever God they want. But as for me and my house, to quote Joshua, we're going to serve the Lord.
Right,
and so it's kind of that like, yes, things are going to change, right? But it's not a total change. There are still elements in the world. So it's not perfect peace. It's not perfect prosperity. It's not, quote, heaven. So that's why I like it, is that it's still kind of where we find ourselves. We can find a contentment and a peace in the Lord now that's not the same thing as everything's hunky-dory and wonderful, right? And so the now, not yet aspect of the kingdom, I think, sort of comes out here.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to stop as any.
Man.
Agree.
Well, we did it. We made it through the last big task before our very early morning flight tomorrow.
Yes.
It wasn't a total train wreck, as it could have
A
been.
minor. Only a few cars fell off.
I'm glad we got to end on a message of hope.
That's right. That's right.
So, all right. Well, thanks for joining us in this episode of the After Class podcast. After Class because
The best conversations happen
after class.
Thank you again for listening to the After Class podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Audio production is provided by Drew Nyquist, and social media is managed by Darren Harris.